Hello and welcome to Varn Blog Solo. Please forgive the mess of the office because we are packing up and relocating it. Hope you're all having a wonderful summer, although you'll probably get this in the beginning of the fall. Every now and then I get asked a question on a video, and this video is what I talk about when I talk about Decadence, which was released, on July 7th. I'm recording this a day later, and I originally recorded that video probably all the way back in May. So so you have a timeline here, let's get into this. Now, let me share my screen. The Cyborg 4K asked me a question, and I want to get into it because it requires an extensive answer, and it's going to clarify a lot of the issues at hand in what I'm talking about in this particular use of theory. Isn't overproduction of elites just another name for the ordinary mismatch between a speculative commodity production and what can actually be sold on a market? No, it is not. And this is what we call an overreduction of the problem. So this looks at one variant that's causing a complex problem, reducing it down to that one simple variant, and saying that explains the whole phenomenon. The problem with the overproduction of elites is it's about the need to create more and more people to fill roles in a society that may or may not be caused for in the overall production scheme. And you go, well, that's about production on commodity production on the market. No, it isn't. Because most of the overproduction of elites are not in explicitly productive roles at all. And their speculation on specific economic resources, which causes shifts in production, is not the only thing causing that. There's also a need for prior systems to maintain themselves by expanding beyond what the market has a capacity for or what society has a capacity for. And I say the latter because production for a speculative commodity market is unique to fairly advanced capitalism. You don't have speculative commodity markets. You don't have grain futures and such in ancient Rome or in the 13th century caliphates, yet you do have the phenomenon of overproduction of elites and overcomplicated societies. And those two theories are not the same. Overproduction of elites is primarily a part of Cleodynamics by Joseph Turchin. Joseph Turchin? I believe it is Joseph Turchin. A theory that I think has flaws because it treats nations kind of as discrete internal societies, at least in the way that Turchin gets his statistics. If you look at Cycles of Decadence, his Secular Cycles book, and his 3 or 4 books on elite overproduction theory, Age of Discord is one I've actually gone over before. You will see that there's actually some limitations where he treats nations as complex systems that are more or less enclosed, and I don't think that's remotely true. So now I do think this is one of the things causing the overproductions of elites. So I think Cyborg 4K is actually correct in one of the issues at hand, but it's one of them. All right. It cannot be used to explain all instances of this phenomenon. So that what he's describing is actually a subset of the phenomenon, one that is unique to capital and doesn't even explain all this phenomenon in capitalist societies. Right? Not all training for development happens in the course of market commodities. In fact, most of them probably happen for war competition and the competition between nation states. So if you don't factor that into your equation, it really doesn't help. Let's go back to the rest of the question. When the demand for a commodity decreases, it takes time to adjust the supply. Yeah, this assumes equilibrium economics in a way. That's you are treating non-productive labor that does not go into producing profits for capital, as something that responds to supply and demand constraints. That's just not really true. It doesn't matter if the commodity is accountants or some kind of microchip. It very much matters whether or not they're productive to overall profitability. And again, that doesn't explain everything I was talking about. Lacking an engine to repair 1950s technology is no different from the total need to repair 1950s technology. Again, I'm not sure what this has to do with decadence, because you're not understanding what I'm saying. You are limiting it to one case use, a kind of, frankly, bad case use that only explains stuff in the private sector, overgeneralizing it as an abstract rule like neoclassical economists do, and then saying we need to throw out this category because this category explains everything, when it doesn't. Wouldn't this be better described as a contradiction generated by built-in obsolescence of commodities? No, it would not. Again, the subset of a thing that explains a thing in one instance cannot be used to explain everything in all instances. So why do we need decadence theory? Because you don't understand the difference between a set and a subset, apparently. I hate to be insulting, but this is a too clever by half explanation that misses the fact that I'm talking about things that are far broader. And if you read the material I referenced, you would know that before you tried to limit it to abstract market equations. I am skeptical whether this is theoretically justified to jump to a general theory of complexity and collapse versus focusing on the manner in which labor and commodities necessarily have to appear within capitalism. Well, you just only want to deal with one case study, and one that doesn't explain everything in capitalism. The realignment of commodities does not explain the expansion or shrinking of non-market-based institutions or quasi-market-based institutions like universities, whose funding is not primarily built on what they do in the market. It comes from government largesse or from speculation unrelated to the primary mission of the university, which is what is happening now. Versus focusing on the manner in which labor and commodities necessarily have to appear within capitalism in terms of collapse, I would expect that most of the time within capitalism is going to take the form of Schumpeter's creative destruction. That's exactly why it's so resilient compared to other forms of life. It can actually tolerate extraordinarily high levels of local and regional collapse. Yes, it can. And that is why it's spread all over the world. But again, are one of the reasons. We don't want to over-reduce here. But again, this is misunderstanding a trend that doesn't just happen in capitalist society, that I was explicit doesn't just happen in capitalist society, unless you think capitalism exists innately in all societies at all times, in which case, I don't know why you're here. That's exactly why it's so resilient compared to other forms of life. It can extraordinarily high levels of local and regional collapse. This is also the question of whether or not war can be seen as some kind of controlled collapse. This is a Grossmanite reading of history. I think war can be seen as a control collapse of overproduction. But again, it's one of many different crisis theories that emerge. In fact, I'm actually going to talk about this. I'm going to pull up a book here that I probably don't reference enough. This is, and I don't have most of my books, but I had this out, and luckily. This is the Theory of History chapter of Analytical Marxism by Tom Meyer. And I'll just read Exploitation in History section on page 45, and I'll put this in the show notes. No other analytical Marxist has proposed a theory of history nearly as coherent and carefully elaborated as Gerald Cohen's. There are, however, other analytical Marxist views on historical development that deserve attention. Some of these do not conflict with Cohen's interpretation, but give the process of history a different emphasis. John Romer, for example, accepts the main concepts of Cohen's technological rendition of historical materialism, but focuses upon the evolution of exploitation. While we can discuss Romer's ideas about exploitation at some length in the next few chapters, it is useful to outline his general vision of history here. Right? So this, As we see, Romer defines exploitation in terms of property relations and says that different forms of exploitation correspond to different property relations. For example, feudal property relations consist in rights over the labor power of the people, and feudal exploitation can exist because these rights are unequally distributed. Capitalist property, on the other hand, includes only those means of productions that are separable from the individual person, land, machines, patents, and capitalist exploitation around when such alienable means of production are distributed unequally. Now, this is an ideal type. I can go into some of the critiques of that. I've talked about it in my Brenner debate discussions behind the paywall. Socialism abolishes capitalist property, but not all forms of property. Socialist property consists of ownership of one's individual productive skills, and socialist exploitation exists because different skills are unequally distributed and individuals can secure differential earnings from them. Yeah, I don't agree with Romer on that, but nonetheless. Over the last 2 millennia, Romer observes the forms of productive property considered socially tolerable have steadily diminished. A feudal society tolerates feudal property, capitalist property, and socialist property, whatever socialist property means. I think it means national property. One of the things I hate about Romer is he takes nationalism and socialism to be, or nationalization and socialization to be fundamentally the same, even though Engels and Kotsky and co. were explicit that they weren't. A feudal society tolerates feudal property, capitalist property, socialist property. A capitalist society tolerates both capitalist and socialist property. A socialist society allows only productive property of the socialist form. Romer, like Cohen, attributes the steady elimination of property forms to the primacy of productive forces. In the last analysis, the ownership appears because of higher development of economic productivity. But exploitation has an important land in the process. So that's one thing he talks about. And so according to this, you could have socialist overproduction of elites. All right. Another thing in this book, and this is on page 43, 3 capitalist crises. So the analytical Marxists tried to lay out the different forms of capitalist crisis in Marx. Analytical Marxism has explicated the conditions under which various kinds of capitalist crises can occur. Once again, we turn to the work of John Romer, who's the first Marxist to show capitalist crises of 3 different kinds can be represented by a single model. In addition to crisis based on the falling rate of profit, Marxist has considered several other varieties of the capitalist economic crises. 3 of the most frequently discussed are profit squeeze, realization crisis, and fiscal crisis. A profit squeeze crisis occurs because the workers consume so much of the economic product that capitalists who control investment have insufficient incentive to accumulate. A realization crisis happens when the volume of production exceeds existing demand and inventories of unsold goods accumulate. That's what you call a crisis of overproduction. And a fiscal crisis develops when taxation snatches so much of the capitalist profits that the incentive to accumulate collapse. That was the analytical Marxist answer to the 1970s, which I don't find particularly salient. So one way to fix the center crisis would be war. It would also be investment into non-productive spheres of the economy that would overproduce elites. So yes, that is a partial explanation for this in capitalism, but it's not an explanation for why this happens in non-capitalist societies and why this leads to class formations, complications, etc. If you're only focusing on the critique of capitalism, you actually can't really plan for minimizing the development of class societies in other forms when you're trying to develop a socialist economy. So you're not seeing why this is important, since you're reducing it to one element of what's causing it. And I'm going to say again, it is not, you cannot explain non-productive to capital surplus areas of the economy that exist offset taxation or subsidy by talking about speculative needs in the market. That assumes a pure market that governs all of society, and that has never existed in reality. Any Marxist would know that. That's taking an eminent critique of the logic of capital and applying it to an actual historical development. That doesn't really work. In fact, that's what neoclassicals do. it's not, you're not coming to the same conclusions as them, obviously, but no. Anyway, back to the question. So I don't see how that much conclusion can be drawn from all this, except that there's a contradiction internal to the position of being a worker, that is, being both a human being and a commodity. And it makes some sense to say workers themselves have to work through this contradiction. It also seems to me to make sense to say that antagonism between the worker and the owner needs to be sublated into a contradiction exists within the universal class of the worker owner by creating an adequate political and economic forms to hold the contradiction without collapsing into one or the other pole. But I guess it's not clear to me how talking about decadence adds anything, because I'm not talking about just that problem. I'm talking about how you'd avoid other forms of self-exploitation or other forms of the administration of general society that are too complicated in energy inputs to maintain. So that matters for how you set up socialism, not just how you undo capitalism. And this deducing things from the abstract logic of capital, which is what you're doing here, by the way. I mean, and only partly. And applying that to a phenomenon that is larger than capitalism pretends that there's no overlap between areas or epochs that have different modes of production. And even Marx didn't think that. Marx actually talks a lot about the recapitulation of prior technologies and prior modes of production that take a new meaning in the current one. The university, which is one of the prime drivers of the overproduction of elites, does exactly that. But remember, the overproduction of elites is not the primary means of overcomplicating a society. The primary means of overcomplicating a society is needing more and more bureaucratic apparatus that requires more and more specialization to maintain. All right. So even within the thing here, you focused on one element of it, explained it under one mode of production condition that only deals with one of the forms of crises that emerge in that mode of production, i.e., capitalism. Now, I don't agree with Romer's three forms of exploitation, in which, we limit how much exploitation we think is tolerable down to socialist exploitation alone. But I think he has a point that it is perfectly logically conceivable that a socialist society would administrate itself in a way that overproduced specialization, because it relied on increasing technological specializations, which would create classes and other divisions, which socialism is supposed to reduce to remove. All right. If you think the goal of socialism in Marxism is a transition between a society that has bourgeois class divisions, gets rid of the initial political class divisions, and starts undoing the economic ones, then if you overcomplicate that society, you would have class society reemerge. It would not necessarily be capitalist class society. It could be all kinds of class societies. So this to me is an over-reading, an over-reduction of the question of a set overcomplication of societies in terms of information and energy inputs into a subset, the overproduction of elites, into a subset of that, the overproduction of elites in a market through misallocation of resources and market demand, which can be answered by creative destruction, i.e. crisis itself, but cannot undo the larger dynamics of overproduction of elites or the overcomplication of societies, because those regional collapses do not actually reset the entire society as a whole. And you can see the history of the 19th and 20th century, the removal of overproduction through war, particularly World War I and World War II, did not simplify society at all. Nor did it move more stuff into the market. It did the opposite, actually. It moved more and more of society as tied to the state to stabilize market instability. So I bring this up not to pick on this question, because I think this is a very smart person. I actually read Cybert's questions a lot. Doing a kind of Marxist analysis where you can deduce from logical postulates. This is almost like the way Austrian economics does praxeology, using abstract models and then draw material conclusions from the abstract model assuming the abstract model is universally applicable within one type, the type being the mode of production called capitalism. And frankly, I don't really think that works. One, I just think we should admit that the overproduction crises are not the only crises of capitalism. There are other things that can reduce profitability or speed up accumulation or whatever. And two, I'm trying to talk about a tendency like the tendency towards oligarchy that is not unique to capitalism. Just as a reminder, the term capitalism is actually used in Capital Volume 1 through 3, I think exactly once. And probably for this reason. Because there's a tendency to reify capital to the point that we're talking about capitalism as a system, and then we talk about all phenomena within capitalism as emerging from within the capitalist system as if it is a coherent phenomenon like that. And it's not. It didn't emerge that coherently, and it's not devolving under clear market logic all the time. And I also think that Schumpeter's point about creative destruction was that capitalism would get so regionally and locally destructive, even though it could tolerate high levels of it, that socialist checks against that destruction would emerge. That was his point. It wasn't just that capitalism was very adapted to crisis, although that's a big point, but that would eventually lead to political backlashes against it. A lot of socialists in the late 20th century actually read Schumpeter as thus embracing socialism because it was a check on capitalist instability as opposed to some result of a final crisis. So you had like this Schumpeterian social democracy. But Schumpeter's point was actually almost an anti-democratic one, that if you had a really democratic society, even though capitalism often worked better in democracies, that there'd be a democratic pushback on the instability of capitalism due to its increased local cost and its increased needs. Now, one thing that you're not dealing with that is actually in Marx that I'll just bring up is the results of the organic the organic development of capital, which is like the fact that you will have technological developments that reduce socially necessary labor time to the point that profitability gets harder there too. That you push more and more people out of the market, which is good for labor. But yeah, now your fundamental point about Marxism and the work and the contradiction between the worker as a commodity and a worker as a free person, that's all a very good exegesis of Marx's key moral well, maybe not moral argument, his key point about the impossibility of the position the worker finds themselves in, right? And I agree with you. I mean, that's a good reading of Marx. But it doesn't help us here. Because again, one of the things I am saying is the overproduction of elites is possible in a non-market society. We know that because it happened in non-market societies, or at least markets without speculative markets. Like they only had direct markets. All right. So there was not futures and misallocation of futures, which caused mismanagement of that resource. So we see those trends in other kinds of societies. The idea that you should only ever look at capitalism as what's leading to things within capitalism ignores the fact that prior forms and prior technologies, social technologies and literal technologies and prior social developments are, let's say, appropriated and subsumed by capital for its own motivations, but do not go away. They're not completely destroyed. Otherwise, why is so much, why is Britain one of the birthplaces of capitalism as a national form? Not the only birthplace by far. I mean, capitalism emerged in Italy, Spain, et cetera, too. A bunch of stuff happened after 1492 that leads to capitalism. But that's full instantiation in a society happened in the nation of Britain, or of England, and in the island of Britain. That's important because Britain's relatively limited but in size. But we have to admit, because it's an island, but we have to admit that it's just not like it didn't destroy all the Ancien regime at all. Like, I think the richest man in England is still technically a feudal landholder. So we see these forms of class society mutate, and these prior formations still exist. When you talk about capitalism as a totality of which there's no way out and nothing priorly really exists, you don't have to explain other developments. You can try to reduce things down to one singular element of capital, and if you fix that one singular element, although no one knows how to fix it, you have abolished the entire problem. That doesn't really work. And this is a long debate between the Brennerites and like classical Marxist and world systems theory people. It's a debate between the analytic Marxists and the Hegelians. It's a debate between the pure Hegelians and the structuralists. It comes up over and over again, and the orthodox Marxists who think both the pure Hegelians and the structuralists are too abstract, that they don't deal with the centrist materiality of history enough. Over and over and over again, this emerges. So if you don't think decadence theory adds to that because it doesn't solve your problem in capital, it's because it's not aimed to just do that. You're critiquing something because it doesn't do what you want it to do and isn't limited to the case study that you want it to be limited to. And like I've said, it doesn't even your thing explains part of this phenomenon in capitalism, but doesn't explain all of it, because you're assuming that even things that are non-productive to capital surplus that don't add to formal GDP or to the ability of capitalists to accumulate more abstract capital, that itself operates under market logics. And while it is subject to market discipline, it does not operate under market logics alone. There are other institutional incentives that are at play, because some of these institutions, like the university, predate capitalism and have been assimilated and assumed by it, and are probably going to get dismantled by it when they no longer serve the primary function. But the other thing that you just don't seem to be dealing with is the economics that are completely unproductive involved in war. And in fact, that's a problem in Marxism in general. Is the economics of war is really under talked about in Marxist case studies. Something for you to think about. Thank you for the brilliant question, even though I came down hard on it, because it is kind of it's a brilliant analysis. It's a good reading of Capital, but it's not a good reading of what I'm talking about. Take care.